It's the 6th of May 2026, day 67, and nobody can agree on whether the war is over. 67 days ago, the United States launched Operation Epic Fury, airstrikes, a naval blockade, economic strangulation on a scale not seen since the Cold War. The stated goal was simple to say and almost impossible to execute: force Iran to give up its nuclear program and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to global shipping. Iran's response was not surrender. It closed the strait. It launched drones and missiles at American facilities and Gulf state infrastructure. It struck the UAE. It directed more than 600 attacks against U.S. facilities in Iraq alone: the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, the Diplomatic Support Center, the consulate in Erbil. It held a quarter of the world's seaborne oil supply hostage and dared the world to do something about it. For 67 days, the global economy bled. U.S. gas prices are up 50% since the war began. Oil demand is falling at the fastest rate seen outside the COVID pandemic. Global oil stockpiles have seen their sharpest decline since COVID. Businesses cut consumption. Consumers cut consumption. The world adjusted, painfully, to a strait that was effectively closed. And then, on Tuesday the 6th of May, Secretary of State Marco Rubio stood in front of reporters and said the words, "Operation Epic Fury is over." So, is the war over? That depends entirely on who you ask. And right now, the US and Iran are giving very different answers. Here is what actually happened in the last 72 hours. On Sunday evening, Trump announced Project Freedom, a US naval operation to physically escort commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz using guided missile destroyers. It was framed as the next phase of pressure, proof that the strait would be reopened by American force if Iran wouldn't open it voluntarily. The operation lasted 2 days. On Monday, U.S. and Iranian military forces exchanged fire in the strait. The U.S. military said it destroyed 6 small Iranian boats and escorted 2 merchant ships through. Iran denied the crossings happened. Iran denied losing any boats. The same event, 2 completely different versions, both told with complete confidence. By Tuesday evening, Trump had paused Project Freedom entirely. His stated reason: great progress toward a complete and final agreement with Iran. Iranian state media had a different headline: Trump backs down. Both things are being said about the same decision made by the same person on the same day. That tells you almost everything you need to know about where this war currently stands. Behind the scenes, something real is happening. The White House is negotiating a 1-page, 14-point memorandum of understanding with Iranian officials. The talks are being led by Trump's envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, working both directly with Iranian counterparts and through mediators. Pakistan has been central to the diplomatic effort. Geneva and Islamabad are both being floated as possible negotiation venues. The MOU, if signed, would declare an end to the war and open a 30-day window for more detailed negotiations. During that window, Iran's restrictions on shipping through the strait and the U.S. naval blockade would both be gradually lifted. If the 30 days collapse without a deal, U.S. forces could restore the blockade and resume military action. It is a framework for a framework. A deal about making a deal. Nothing has been agreed yet, but sources briefed on the talks say this is the closest the 2 sides have been to an agreement since the war began. Here is what the MOU currently contains. Iran would commit to a moratorium on nuclear enrichment. The duration is still being negotiated. Iran proposed 5 years, the US demanded 20, and 3 sources say the likely landing spot is somewhere around 12 to 15. The US also wants a provision that any Iranian violation would automatically extend the moratorium. Iran would commit to never seeking a nuclear weapon or conducting weaponization-related activities. It would agree to enhanced inspections, including snap inspections by UN inspectors. There are discussions about a clause prohibiting Iran from operating underground nuclear facilities. Here is the part that surprised almost everyone. 2 sources claim Iran has agreed to remove its highly enriched uranium from the country entirely. This was a key US priority that Tehran had refused to even discuss until now. One option being considered: moving the material to the United States. In exchange, the US would gradually lift sanctions and release billions of dollars in frozen Iranian funds held around the world. This is where the question of who won gets genuinely complicated. Look at it from the American side, and the picture looks like progress. Iran is being asked to give up enrichment for over a decade, to submit to snap inspections, to remove its most dangerous nuclear material from the country. These are significant concessions from a country that has spent decades insisting its nuclear program is entirely civilian and entirely non-negotiable. The U.S. naval blockade remains in place. The economic pressure remains. Iran's oil exports have collapsed. Its foreign currency inflows have dried up. Millions of Iranian jobs have paused or disappeared. The country imposed a near-total internet shutdown on its own citizens. These are the signs of a country under enormous strain. Look at it from the Iranian side and the picture looks different. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz for 67 days. The most powerful navy on earth could not fully reopen it. Trump launched Project Freedom and then paused it 2 days later after Iranian warnings. Iranian state media is calling that a retreat, and they are not entirely wrong. The U.S. never achieved its stated primary objective, reopening the strait. The combat operation has ended without Iran signing anything. The ceasefire is holding not because Iran was defeated, but because neither side wants to escalate back to full-scale war. Iran's hardline leaders are still in power. Its nuclear program still exists. The strait is still effectively closed. Iran's parliament speaker said this week that the current situation is unbearable for the United States, while Iran has not even begun yet. That is bravado. But it is bravado that the U.S. has not been able to fully silence. Here is the problem with the MOU, even if it gets signed. The White House itself acknowledges that Iranian leadership is divided. Hardline factions inside Tehran have shown no interest in compromise. Moderate voices exist, but they are not in control. Forging consensus across those factions on something as significant as a nuclear moratorium and the removal of enriched uranium within 48 hours, which is the window U.S. officials are currently working to, is an extraordinary ask. Some U.S. officials remain privately skeptical that even the initial one-page agreement will be reached. This is not the first time the administration has expressed optimism about a deal. It has done so at multiple points during the war. None of those optimistic moments produced a signed agreement. Rubio himself, at the same briefing where he declared Operation Epic Fury over, called some of Iran's top leaders insane in the brain and said it was unclear whether they would make a deal. That is a remarkable thing to say about your negotiating counterpart when you are simultaneously claiming talks are progressing toward a final agreement. There are other forces at play here beyond the two principal parties. China. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi flew to Beijing this week for face-to-face talks with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the first time the two allies have met in person since the war began. China is Iran's biggest oil buyer. Its economy is directly exposed to a closed strait. Beijing has been working the diplomatic circuit for weeks, calling for an end to the conflict. Trump himself suggested China helped push Iran toward the negotiating table. Trump is due in Beijing next week for what would be the most consequential foreign trip of his second term. It is almost certainly not a coincidence that the Iran situation is approaching some kind of resolution, or at least some kind of pause, right before that meeting. Russia has also been engaged. Rubio spoke with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Tuesday. The call was at Russia's request. Following a separate call with Putin last week, Trump indicated Russia had offered to help in the Iran situation, specifically around the question of enriched uranium. Pakistan has been the primary diplomatic intermediary. The Pakistani government brokered the original ceasefire and has been pushing for the MOU framework. Trump's Truth social post announcing the Project Freedom pause specifically cited Pakistan's request as part of his reasoning. The war between the U.S. and Iran is not a two-party conflict anymore, if it ever was. The diplomatic pressure to end it is coming from China, Russia, Pakistan, and a coalition of other countries whose economies cannot afford an indefinitely closed strait. And while the diplomacy happens, the strait remains dangerous. On Wednesday morning, a cargo vessel in the Strait of Hormuz was struck by an unknown projectile. The UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre confirmed it from a verified source. The environmental impact was unknown. The vessel's registration and crew details were not released. This happened on day 67, while ceasefire negotiations were ongoing. While both sides were supposedly moving toward an agreement, the strait is not safe. It is not open. Whatever is being negotiated in Islamabad or Geneva has not yet changed what happens to ships that try to move through 33 kilometers of water off the Iranian coast. So who won? The honest answer is that nobody has won yet. And the final answer depends entirely on what happens in the next 48 hours, the next 30 days, and the next decade of whatever nuclear agreement emerges from this. If Iran signs the MOU, commits to a 12 to 15-year enrichment moratorium, submits to SNAP inspections, and removes its highly enriched uranium from the country, the United States can credibly claim it achieved its core strategic objective. The nuclear threat from Iran pushed back by a generation. The strait eventually reopened. The war ended on American terms, even if it didn't feel like it day to day. If Iran walks away from the table, or if the 30-day negotiating window collapses, the U.S. will face a choice between resuming a war it has already said is over or accepting a stalemate in which Iran controls the strait and retains its nuclear program. That is not a victory. If the deal happens but Iran's hardliners undermine it within a few years, violating the enrichment moratorium, building underground facilities, expelling inspectors, then what looks like a U.S. victory now becomes something murkier in retrospect. Iran, meanwhile, gets sanctions relief and frozen funds released. It gets the U.S. naval blockade lifted. It survives 67 days of the most powerful military on Earth and walks away with its government intact, its hardliners still in power, and a deal that preserves its right to eventually enrich uranium again after the moratorium expires. That is not nothing. What is clear is this: Operation Epic Fury is over. Project Freedom is paused. The combat is stopped for now. A one-page document is being negotiated in back channels. The world is holding its breath, waiting for Iran's response on several key points in the next 48 hours. A cargo ship was hit by a projectile in the strait this morning. The ceasefire is holding, barely. And 33 kilometers of water between two coastlines remains the most consequential piece of geography on Earth right now. Whatever gets signed or doesn't get signed in the coming days, this war has already changed the world. The global economy has been restructured around a closed strait. The U.S. has demonstrated both the reach and the limits of its military power. Iran has demonstrated that a country under maximum pressure can still hold a choke point that the entire world depends on. Nobody won cleanly, nobody lost completely. And the next chapter is being written right now in a negotiating room somewhere between Islamabad and Geneva on a single page, 14 points, with the fate of the strait and Iran's nuclear program hanging on whether two sides that have been bombing each other for 67 days can find enough common ground to stop. The war may be over, or it may be halftime.